Hello and welcome back to the shop. Today's video is an in-depth look at how I forge and finish a sheath or belt knife inspired by the Northwoods belt knives of yesteryear. Perhaps called a hunting knife, but very useful for a wide range of tasks around the camp, whether you're hunting, fishing, or simply out enjoying the wilderness. This project starts with a piece of steel that must be freed from the troublesome cardboard carton and the plastic wrap. Best done with an axe that you forged yourself if possible. At least a lot more fun. This steel is 3/16 inch thick by about 1 1/4 inch and 24 inches long, so this piece will yield 4 knives of this particular design. That is one advantage to a hidden Tang knife. You use less material for the overall knife, and therefore you can make more knives from one piece of steel. As usual, this is 52100 52100 high carbon steel, my preferred and most used steel for almost all of my knives. The portaband saw definitely makes quick work of this steel stock. It is in a softened state from the manufacturer, from the dealer, which really helps in cutting it into pieces for our particular blades. There's not an exact measurement to this project. I have an idea of what I want in my mind, mostly formulated, and so that's what we're going to start with. The first step is to heat up the end of the piece of steel that is going to be the tang. We'll get the little giant power hammer greased up and ready to run here. Using the edges of my forging dies on the power hammer, I can create a nice clean shoulder for the transition between the Tang and the ricasso on the knives here. As I'm forging the width of the Tang down to a nice taper, I must also forge a taper on the thickness because it's going to get widened out, or it's going to become thicker as I forge that width down. I want a taper on both sides of the Tang. Once I've completed the Tang, I can begin forging the blade. I'll start first by thinning down or narrowing down the width of the steel. It's going to widen back out as I forge the bevel. There's numerous ways to forge a blade, and whenever you're forging a bevel, you are necessarily moving the material on one side of the blade more than the other. I'm doing a slight counter bend right at where the ricasso will start to offset the movement of material, but I'm not going to do a full counter bend on the blade. With the bevel nicely started, I'll go to addressing the tip of the knife. Now you'll notice right here how quickly and easily you can forge in a classic clip point, famous in the Bowie knife design. And I think, frankly, that is where that design came from more than actual function. Simple manufacturing techniques that were used on a regular basis, and they were adopted into regular use. But I'm going for more of a straight spine, less of a clip point, and so I'll forge that tip down around further. Once that's complete, I can continue forging the bevel, and you'll notice this curves the blade up into a more exaggerated manner. I do want a distal taper on this blade, and so now that I have the bevel forged most of the way, I can begin thinning down the spine to form that distal taper, and as you see here, that nicely straightens the blade out. So a large counter bend at the beginning is not necessary. Stamping my maker's mark into the blade so there's no question where it came from, and straightening the blade, starting on the power hammer and then moving to the anvil with a small hammer for better finesse. During each step of the process, I want to complete it as accurately and as well as possible, building upon that during the next stage or the next phase of this project. If you allow little things to get by, they can build up over the time that you're building the project and create more problems the further along you get. Now that the blades are forged, I'm starting the heat treating processes on them, which begins with normalizing. After normalizing, there's an annealing cycle, and then finally a grain refinement cycle, which is more about getting it into a fine pearlitic stage prior to austenitizing and quenching. Going into the kiln for the final time, and then we can quench and harden the blades. I don't want to quench the blade all the way down to ambient temperature. This is a good way to end up with more warps and even cracks in your blade, and it's not necessary for full hardness on the steel. I'm looking for a specific temperature range in which the oil does not immediately evaporate off of the blade despite a little bit of smoke coming off of it. Allowing the blade to cool down fully from this point will allow some bainite to form, which is a tougher phase of steel, and also allow the martensitic conversion to be more gradual and even temper it slightly immediately after it occurs. Also, you can do some straightening on the blade out of the quench, which is also helpful. Finally, into the tempering cycle, and once 2 cycles have been completed, these blades are fully heat treated and ready to be ground. To this point, I haven't touched them with the grinder, simply forged in the bevel to rough specifications, leaving extra material on there as you want to do to avoid a decarb layer in your finished product. This is kind of nice because now I can do all of my grinding following the forging and heat treating. starting by cleaning up the profile and getting rid of any decarburized steel at the edge of the blade. It's very important, of course, to make sure the blade stays under the final tempering temperature, and preferably far under that. It's easy to feel the steel heating up in your hands, and as you'll notice, as I begin grinding the bevel, I dip it in water after every pass. If the blade were to heat up beyond the temperature that it was tempered at, it would begin to ruin the hardness of the steel and make it an inferior blade. These blades have a flat grind on them, which I find to be quite satisfactory and very functional for most tasks on a general use outdoors blade. It provides great cutting clearance and also good strength to the overall blade. It can be ground and sharpened to a very keen, sharp edge. Once we've finished grinding the blade, it is time to hand sand it for a final finish on the bevels and the ricasso as needed. I ground the blade up to 220 grit, and that's what I'm starting with on the hand sanding, and then I will finish out at 500 grit. It's important to get all of the scratches from the previous grinding or sanding process. Make sure that those are completely gone before moving on to the next grit. To facilitate this, I tend to sand in the opposite direction as the last process before finishing it in a nice linear micro scratch pattern that gives that nice hand rubbed finish on the finished blade. Next, I'll clean up the ricasso and the spine, making sure those are up to the appropriate finish with the rest of the blade. Now that the blade is finished and ready for the furniture, as it were, I mark out where I want the shoulders on my ricasso to go. This is where the guard will fit up against the blade. This carbide insert file guide is extremely useful in doing this process, and I use it right on my grinding belt, on my grinder here. Starting the rough in on a ceramic belt, trying to keep it away from the carbide file guide because it doesn't really cut it, but it does kind of start to scar it up a little bit. And then I'll move to a softer aluminum oxide belt and really get right up against the file guide there for some nice, crisp, shiny, even polished shoulders there. Rounding off the tang right at that intersection or junction for a radiused corner there. I need to make sure that there's a nice taper to the tang on the thickness as well. All of these processes are important prior to fitting up the guard and will make the guard fit up much easier. There we go, very nice. Nicely prepped tang, crisp shoulders at the ricasso, and we can start building the guard for this knife. .3/16 by 1 inch brass stock. We'll mark out the approximate width of the tang where it needs to meet up to the ricasso and start by drilling out some holes smaller in diameter than the finished width of the tang, or thickness of the tang, I should say. Rotary tool makes quick work of the rough out process. You have to be careful with this. It can get away from you and dig into the side, creating a problem that you can't really fix, and you'd have to start over on a new piece of brass stock. Now it's just a matter of carefully filing, checking, and fitting until the brass guard fits up snugly close to the shoulders, and then we will tap it into place with a little bit of pressure. I've taken to using just chainsaw files for fitting up my guard instead of a flat file. If you use it carefully, you can accomplish basically the same thing. Still using my old crummy pipe driver for the guard. I need to get a little better setup on this, but it will still do the trick. Needed a little bit more relief at the shoulders here, so carefully take out some material for that to fit right down onto the surface of the guard. This was a step that I did to flatten out the guard, and I goofed up because, as you can see, this little brass hammer imparted a very distinct textured surface to the guard, but then I decided to keep it and texture the whole thing, which kind of matches the forged texture on the ricasso, and I think it came together pretty neat. So we've got a pretty nice guard fit up there, pretty happy with that. I debated what sort of handle material to use on this knife, but when you think of a classic belt knife or hunting knife, stag or antler definitely comes to mind. So I decided to go with a piece of elk antler shed. Antler can provide a very ergonomic and secure grip, but you're definitely working with or around this material because it kind of dictates to some degree what you're going to use it for and how you're going to use it. Instead of just carving out a block of wood, you can do pretty much whatever you want with it. You kind of have to work with the contours of the piece of antler a little more than you do other materials. So we've got it fitting up nicely to the guard, and at this point really I'm kind of feeling my way forward because I have a vague idea of what I want it to look like, but I'm also kind of trying to work with the natural material here of the antler, and so we'll set that aside for a second and work on putting a threaded end to the tang of the knife. Initially I thought I might do a pinned handle, but then when I decided to go with the antler, I knew I needed some kind of butt cap, and so I decided to simply do a threaded butt cap and use that to secure the whole thing together. This is a 1/4 inch by 20 thread bolt, 1/4 inch 20 bolt, and we'll use this to extend the tang the rest of the way necessary and give us the threads we need. I'm using my arc welder to attach it, and this is not the best way to do it. You have to be very careful and turn the voltage down. My initial attempt melted the end of the tang, which isn't surprising since a high carbon steel has a lower melting point. I had to redress up the end of the tang and retry the whole process and sort of tack weld it on little by little. Got a nice strong bond there, and then heat it up to a dull red, which you can't see in the camera, to make sure that there's no brittle steel at that junction there. Next, we'll drill out a piece of brass to tap some threads into, and I used a piece of brass much larger than I needed, again, because I wasn't quite sure how I was going to finish this out. in the final analysis. But it was kind of a scrap piece anyway, so not a big deal. Using the drill press to align my tap with the hole in the piece of brass for a nice straight thread cutting there. The threads on my bolt were not quite clean enough to get the brass cap on there, so I had to use a die to clean those threads up, and then everything went together nicely. You can see where I've started to grind down the antler at the front of the handle, kind of feeling my way forward as to what it's going to look like in the ergonomics on the final project. So the threads there, threading the butt cap on did not align it quite right, and that's simply a matter of grinding off just a little bit of the length of the antler, allowing that to screw down a little bit tighter, and we got it to where we wanted it. I did quite a bit of pre-shaping on this, again, because I was trying to see where I was going with it before I actually put it all together and filled everything up with epoxy. So I didn't really need to do that much shaping on it prior to assembling it, but it turned out fine. And I went ahead and bedded the entire Tang in real time there with epoxy, so that there's no voids down inside that handle. And then epoxy between the brass and the antler at both ends, and tighten that down right to where it was supposed to go. Thanks for coming along on this project. I hope you enjoyed it and maybe learned a little something. I know I did. Pictures of the knife in just a second here. I think it turned out pretty cool. Let me know what you think in the comments below. If you're interested in getting one of my knives, check out my website, firecreekforge.com. Make sure to get on my email list, and I'll notify you when I have new batches of knives and axes ready, which is usually once every 1 to 2 weeks. Thanks for watching. We'll see you on the next video.